The Tom Woods Show, episode 2292.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, I don't know about you, but I am running into a lot of progressives saying, look, police, fire, schools, these are all great examples of socialism. Well, let's focus on that school example. I've got a free ebook called Education Without the State that makes a pretty darn good case for a stateless approach to education. Pick it up at nostateeducation.com. Hey folks, Tom Woods here. Michael Malice is back with us. We're talking once again about his book, The White Pill, A Tale of Good and Evil. Let me actually start before we get into Stalin and resume the story with what the motivation for you was behind this.
For the book?
Yeah. You could write about anything. You're a talented guy. Why this?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, it really bothered me how so many people in circles that I travel in think that it's a wrap. America's a wrap or the West is a wrap due to different trends, right? That there's no possible way these trends are going to be reversible in the near future or ever. And I am very hopeful that they are, but my hopefulness isn't because I'm some kind of sunny person who thinks humans are basically good. I'm like, we've been through not this exact thing, but in situations before where it would be irrational to have any kind of hope of any reasonable or strong change. And that rational, realistic approach was absolutely incorrect. And then very quickly, retroactively became, oh, it was inevitable. So that really bothered me. It bothered me that we talk so much about like World War I and World War II and Civil War and all these monuments. This was a great victory that was done relatively peacefully and in our lifetimes. And because you don't have this narrative of bloodshed, somehow the victory is considered to be lesser, which is just kind of tacitly a glorification of massive destruction and death. To paraphrase kind of Trump, I like the wars where people aren't killed, where it's just like a bunch of people sit down and they hate each other and they have opposing views, but it all kind of works out in a sense and no one's needlessly slaughtered or even needfully slaughtered. So this kind of spoke to why I am hopeful about the future, why I'm also optimistic about the future. And it also bothered me that where I came from has become largely vanishing from popular consciousness, which is something we talk more about World War II and the Civil War and the Revolutionary War than we do about the Soviet Union. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to do something about that. So I think those are some of the reasons why I thought this book was important. And also, it was important to me to kind of give testimony to these millions of people who suffered for their entire lives for no reason whatsoever. And to make sure with the small amount of power I have, to make sure that they're not forgotten.
Yeah. Well, let's say something about the terror famine, 1932 to 33 in Ukraine, where to this day...
Can I talk about that for a second? Because this is really interesting with what's going on recently in social media.
Yeah, sure. But I was just going to say that to this day, you can still find apologists for the Soviets saying that the reason that journalists said that we don't see any famine is that there wasn't one, that this is made up. This is a made up accusation by the capitalists. Even now, I hear people saying that.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. That Khrushchev lied. When I was on Lex Fridman's show talking about what my family went through in Ukraine with the Holocaust and fleeing the Nazis, and it brought a tear to my eye because you try to realize when it hits close to home, it's very different than reading in a book or in a museum. And a bunch of the Nazis were like, oh, you're crying about the Holocaust. Why don't you talk about the Holodomor? And I'm like, calm down, Nazis. I'll get to that. I'm working on it right now. And in recent times, I've seen this on social media where people are saying my family's responsible for this because it was a Jewish thing, that my grandfather was a Bolshevik. It's so crazy to me, the levels of propaganda and misinformation, to use a bad term, that is still a century later prevalent about these events. But yes, I think they're correct in this sense. This is something that needs to be discussed much more often. The systemic starvation and oppression of the Ukrainian peasantry in the early 30s.
So the motivation behind it, well, what is the motivation behind it?
Well, there's a couple, this is kind of ambiguous, right? Like, why did Stalin do this? The most obvious answer is Ukraine and Russia have had enmity for centuries. And this is a great mechanism for bringing Ukraine under the Soviet thumb and rubric, which it did. I mean, it really broke the people very effectively for a very long time. Another mechanism is like, all right, like I'm Stalin, I'm in power as a result of this ideology. I'm just going to put it into practice. Price be damned. And he did exactly that. And I think it's just also useful for a totalitarian regime to have no one feel safe. Because if no one feels safe, no one's going to start kind of thinking about revolution and undermining your power or even overthrowing it. And it's also, they needed money. And you can sell grain for export and make money that way. It's not like the factories are producing things of value.
True. As time goes on, what it takes to qualify as a quote unquote kulak,
Yes.
the threshold becomes quite low, that you don't appear to be visibly starving, became one of the ways they would tell that they would accuse you of being up to no good.
And here's another useful thing. If I have control of information in my country and there's no food, now I can blame the Ukrainians. Because you all know, growing up, Ukraine's the breadbasket of Europe. That's where all grain comes from. Now, if there's no food in the stores, it's not my fault. It's their fault because they're the ones producing it. So Stalin very effectively created this outgroup among the Russian population. And the Ukrainians who fled to the cities to try to get food, people would just refuse them and blame them who were starving. And they could see that they're starving. It's still your fault that there's no bread on the shelves.
So the idea was to so-called collectivize agriculture.
Right.
And so what is collectivization? What is it?
So instead of Tom Woods has a little plot of land and you're growing your wheat or barley or whatever, and you've got maybe like a cow and Michael has his and so on and so forth, all the plots are going to be combined and we're sharing tools and we're sharing tractors or whatever, and we're all working together for the benefit of all. And it's a system that doesn't make any sense. Certainly the incentives are not to work particularly harder. And the other disincentive is no matter how hard you and I work, you're going to take it all away anyway. So, it's not a surprise that the grain production dropped significantly. And also there was a mass slaughter of livestock because it's like, all right, we're going to take your cow, or you're going to take your horse, or we're going to take your whatever they're raising, and you're going to have nothing for it. It's like, well, I'm hungry. At the very least, I'm going to kill this cow myself and have some steaks and some leather other than giving it to you and having nothing to show for it.
I recall a statistic from the 1980s when Gorbachev allowed, I guess it was something like 2% of the agricultural land could be held privately. And it turned out it wound up producing like 1/3 of the agricultural output of the country.
Yeah.
So,
well, Gorbachev saw firsthand the problems of the Holodomor. He had family members who starved. A large percentage of his village starved. So he was the first Russian leader who was born after the Russian Revolution. So that's the other thing with these totalitarian dictatorships. If you kill someone's family, and this is the same thing with war, you kill someone's family, those kids grow up and they're rarely happy about what you've done to them.
yeah. What's the best estimate for how many people perished in that?
I think 5 million.
Good grief. And
And
yet,
it's also people are starving the rest of Russia in the Soviet Union. It wasn't just, the famine wasn't localized to Ukraine.
well, what about, I did say something about journalists, and there's Gareth Jones and Malcolm Muggeridge who said something screwy here, but they were, for some reason, the outliers. What's the story there?
For some reason, right, Tom?
Yeah. How about that, right?
Yeah. Walter Duranty, who thankfully has become much more of a household name in recent years, was the New York Times man in Moscow. He got an interview with Stalin. He stole Aleister Crowley, the first Satanist girlfriend, and I think married her or whatever it was. And he just was the dean, effectively, of the Moscow press corps. And he made it a point to tell people in the West, and this is the New York Times paper of record, there's no famine. They're just tightening their belts. This is just anti-communist propaganda. These people know what they're talking about. The experts agree. They've been through this before, and so on and so forth. So it's not only that he was, and I have a lot of quotes from him in this book, where he's just explicitly saying, this is all BS. There's no problems with the food situation. The only people complaining are like Karen malcontents. The real people are working hard to make sure there's food for everyone. And when Gareth Jones and Malcolm Muggeridge discovered the truth and spirited the truth out to the West, he went out of his way, and so did his colleagues, to denounce them and say they don't know what they're talking about. He even said, you shouldn't send, or you don't want journalists to come here. There's nothing to see. He discouraged explicitly journalists. And one thing they said, look, There's nothing to see in these villages. Everyone's fine. Look for yourself. You can look for yourself and you'll see that this is just capitalist propaganda.
Right. But if you say don't come.
Don't come.
Yeah.
A reporter to say, don't come and look for yourself. To me, to see all these quotes. So this is what drives me crazy about these like conservatives who are like, well, journalists used to be honest. This is the 30s. This is almost 100 years ago. And he's saying in writing, don't come and look for yourself. Trust me, everything is fine. And then later, he admitted, he's like, oh, well, you try to do your best, but sometimes you get it wrong. And it's like, this is millions of people who were starved. This isn't, I got the wrong address when I was mailing my resume.
Right. Meanwhile, also going on at roughly this time or shortly thereafter is a series of ongoing mass arrests. And it's interesting to look at exactly who's being targeted, but then also to remember that even if, okay, let's say somebody really is a saboteur, you can at least understand why the regime doesn't like saboteurs.
Sure.
But the problem with that is, if you're not a saboteur, then you think to yourself, oh, I guess I'm safe. The idea is to keep people completely off balance. So you can't just go after the saboteurs. It's okay, basically, if somebody who hasn't done a thing wrong winds up getting caught up in it, because then everybody is on edge.
Because very quickly it becomes, why didn't you turn in your coworker who's a saboteur? Are you in cahoots with him?
Right.
And what are you supposed to say to that? Well, no, I just didn't notice. You're not being vigilant, comrade, in this kind of great revolution. You don't care. So there's nothing you can say.
I want to read another passage. This is from page 94. This is a journalist speaking, kind of summarizing the initial process here. Imagine, if you can, the 3 million Americans holding the most strategic posts of power and influence in our country being suddenly subjected to a pitiless public inquiry into their past history, even unto their great-grandparents, into their political faith, private conduct, and more intimate personal foibles. Imagine this inquiry conducted under conditions which made it the duty of every neighbor and office boy to question and accuse these upper 3 million. Imagine that, and you have some inkling of what took place in Russia. That's terrifying.
Yes. And also terrifying, as Eugene Lyons later pointed out, that the same Western influencers who tripped over themselves to defend Sacco and Vanzetti and try to keep them from the death penalty, perhaps correctly, were tripping over themselves to defend the Soviet Union's right and need to murder its own citizens.
I like this passage. Now, this one's from you. This is Malice, page 95. Not only did the confessions, because the key to the trials was getting the men to confess, not only did the confessions serve to implicate the defendants of their alleged crimes, they also served a further purpose, scapegoating for the ongoing and enormous economic hardships. The greater the number of men who confessed to plotting with Trotsky for every crime imaginable, and several that were objectively unimaginable, the greater Stalin looked in comparison, and the more justified the purge of society became. And elsewhere in the book, you say that given that Marxism is supposed to be a scientific ideology, then of course it's supposed to lead to a better society and more abundance. And so if it doesn't, then it can't be there's something wrong with the philosophy. It means there must be saboteurs. So it's a constant pretext to keep on looking for them and keep on looking.
Well, there's a parallel here, and I don't like making this parallel because it's like pure evil versus largely good. But when you hear people here defending the Constitution and being like, well, we just have to get in the right politicians who are going to make it work. It's like at a certain point, if it doesn't work, no matter who's in charge in Washington, it's not the politician's fault, right? So there's kind of this idea that at a certain point, if all these like rando people can make your system unworkable, how workable was the system to begin with?
I mean, that is a legitimate question. Don't discuss it with your neighbors, however.
Right. Yeah. And here's the other thing, Tom. The other thing that was useful is you can now say with a straight face, all these people confessed. This isn't a conspiracy theory. They got up in front of the courtroom and they said, I was a wrecker. I plotted with Trotsky. Why would someone confess to something like that? And Upton Sinclair, who I do a great job kind of eviscerating in this book, and for very good reason, he makes the point about like, you should be believing them. Like, why would they be lying about their confessions?
Yeah, so that's another thing, is that we were talking in the last episode about Western complicity in all this by explaining it away or covering it up or making excuses for it. While this is going on, there are people in the West saying this, that, well, it's not easy when you have all these saboteurs around you. I mean, they were falling for it.
Yeah.
Or I don't know, were they falling for it? Or was it a matter of, if you're going to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs and we have to cover up for him breaking the eggs?
They were falling for it. They were absolutely falling for it, in my opinion. It seemed clear that, because it's kind of this Jonathan Haidt thing, that you start with the conclusion being that they are more good than bad. And then once you have any evidence, you kind of force it to fit your preconceived notions. And Upton Sinclair asked the rhetorical question, what could possibly be done to someone to get them to confess to a crime they never did? That doesn't make any sense. Really? Well, the rest of the book demonstrates exactly what was done to these people to get them to confess to things that not only did they not do, but they literally could not have done. There were a couple of examples where people were like, oh yeah, I met with Trotsky at this hotel, whatever it was Sweden or something. And then the Swedish newspaper's like, this hotel hasn't existed in 20 years.
Yeah. I want to read this. So this will be the last passage, but I just love these. There are just so many good ones. This is somebody who was indeed arrested in this process, and he recalls this. From the moment he is arrested, the prisoner is kept in constant suspense. No matter what is done to him or where he is taken, he is given no explanation. This permanent uncertainty and complete helplessness in the grip of a silent, uncanny power produces in every prisoner exactly what it is expected to produce: fear. Now, when we're talking about all these arrests, and then eventually we get to the establishment of the Gulag, are we able to estimate how many people we're talking about who were in fact rounded up?
Yeah, I think the numbers are somewhere in the book, and they're just completely astronomical.
It just seems hard to believe that you could get away with that on such a large scale, simply going door to door.
Well, why?
Again, the overwhelming majority versus the small minority problem.
But it wasn't the overwhelming majority. The overwhelming majority just sat on their hands. I mean, Tom, in the last couple of years, we had literally everyone imprisoned in their homes. So it's not going to be that hard if everyone's in constant terror. And if you speak out, if I criticize what the government's doing in that country, then right away, I'm clearly on the side of the enemy of the people. And not only am I arrested, I'm going to be tortured, and whoever I talk to, you're next. I'm dropping your name first, Tom.
Yeah, it's interesting you put it that way, Michael, because ever since COVID, which is what we endured during COVID is, pales by comparison to what we're describing now, but it's still a study in human behavior.
Yes.
And what we observed there, I think, makes it easier to understand a lot of what happened in history.
The thing that I had misunderstood, and I would bet you had misunderstood, and what a lot of people had misunderstood, I had been under the naive belief that these people who were informers in the Soviet Union and later in East Germany with the Stasi did so because they had a gun to their head, right? They take me in, torturing me, and they're like, all right, who have you talked about politics in the last 10 days? Tom Woods, Dave Smith, I'm rattling off the names. Or else they're going to start pulling off my fingernails, right? So at a certain point, Tom, with sleep deprivation, I'm sure you understand. That's what I thought was the situation. What I learned and what COVID demonstrated is that there was no shortage of people tripping over themselves to turn people in because they thought that made them a good person. Journalist Anna Funder interviewed a former Stasi recruiter, and she asked about this, and she's like, they weren't forced. They barely got paid anything. A lot of them were just lonely, and a lot of them felt like finally someone's listening to them, and it made them feel important. And when you see it like that, that to me is clearly true and extremely disturbing. And we saw it. People couldn't wait to boast on social media about turning in somebody who wasn't wearing a mask or so on and so forth.
Yeah. The difference in our case was that even though, there was some suppression of opinion on social media, I'm not going to minimize that, but you could still see in the comments that you weren't crazy. There were a lot of people who agreed with you and who thought that this person who wanted to turn people in was the crazy one. And you could at least be assured, all right, well, somewhere out there are a lot of people who think the way I do.
Right.
But you didn't have any of that such assurance. And you would be terrified to talk to people about it because you don't know who's going to turn you in.
Here's the other thing. You're going to have like two families living in a room together, which is not going to be fun in any situation. And there was even this dark Russian joke in it, which I'll get to in a second. If it's the Malice family and the Woods family, and you got 5 daughters and they're running around being annoying, all it takes is one phone call and then I have the whole place to myself. Maybe I wouldn't do it, or I'd like to think I wouldn't do it, but that's sure a big incentive for a lot of people. And the Russian joke was, I'm so stupid. I turned in Galka, but Malka had the bigger room.
Well, so I want to do one more thing here. I
Sure.
love this line. This is your line, page 107. The biggest crime in the Soviet Union was knowing Stalin's secrets. And I read that and I thought, that's a great observation, because Stalin realizes that there are certain people who know more than anyone what he's been up to, that the people they've targeted have been innocent. And of course, those are the interrogators themselves. They all know this has been a sham. So therefore, now it's time to turn the knives on the interrogators themselves. So even if you have kissed up to the regime, you've followed everything that's expected of you, you've carried out horrific atrocities, your time comes too.
And he also purged the judges. So these prisoners who were tortured into confessions they didn't make were locked in a room with the judge who sentenced them often.
That's insane.
Yes. And I think like the whole Belarusian government was arrested. Like one of these republics, like the entire parliament was arrested, like with except for one person. It was something that I have a list in there of all the people who were arrested, and you look through it and you're just like, you can't even wrap your head around what this must have been like in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. You spent quite an amount of time, appropriately enough, specifically on the Gulag. So the people there are not immediately executed or put on trial, but they're just sent there for hard labor, and they're sent to a place where escape is a death sentence. Even if you could get away with escaping, where are you going to go?
Right. That's the other thing is there was one guy who left, because this is Siberia, right? This is the Arctic or subarctic, technically, I'm not sure. And he's just first of all, no one's going to take you in. If you're a former prisoner, escaped prisoner, and you're kind of hiding them, you're done. So they're going to be turning you in. And a guy who escaped, they didn't even bother searching for him. They're like, he's either going to die or come crawling back. And he came crawling back. And for the rest of his days, he told everyone else in the Gulag, this is our fate. There's no point in trying to escape. This is our punishment here on Earth. And I mean, talk about a Debbie Downer, but I'm being a little glib about it, but where are they going to go? Right. And imagine even here, you're in some prison in like rural Montana and you get out. Where are you going then?
Yeah. Yeah. And then you have this. You quote somebody in the book who tried to warn that the people in these camps might die. And the response was, what people? These are enemies of the people. And then you quote other officials as saying, we're not trying to bring down the mortality rate. So apparently you're not a person. So you're not.
Rapists and murderers were explicitly, and this is the same case in North Korea today, were explicitly, not implicitly, treated better. They were told, you are still people, you're just criminals. These are enemies of the people. And they were encouraged, or the guards were scared or looked the other way, to brutalize people who were arrested for political purposes, including the sexual assaults on children and things like this. So the thing with these regimes is no matter how bad you think it is, where it's just like, okay, you're hungry, and then you got to always praise Stalin, and then you got a crappy job in the factory for 16 hours a day, that is a drop in the bucket compared to how bad it was from this entire country.
After Stalin's death, and that's 1953, 3 years pass until we get that famous so-called De-Stalinization speech by Khrushchev. Now, in that speech, he denounces much of what has gone on within the Soviet Union in past years. But my recollection of the speech is that although it recounts numerous horrors, the primary concern was he was actually attacking other Bolsheviks, and that shouldn't be done. It's not a repudiation entirely of the use of, let's say, gruesome methods per se.
Oh, no, I disagree. If you go back and read it, he really is like a lot of people who are great people were tortured, or I forgot the euphemism he used, but it was clearly euphemisms were tortured into making confessions that didn't work. So he did go after very explicitly, or explicit as he could, the brutality. And not just that because they were targeting Bolsheviks. It's like they were targeting like hardworking men and women and the workers. So you have to credit Khrushchev for that, which I do.
So what is Soviet life like under Khrushchev then? Is it not what Ayn Rand described?
It's much, I don't want to say it's significantly better. First of all, immediately after Stalin dies, they start shutting down the gulags, which is a terrific step in the right direction. You know, he had his own personality cult, but there was not this kind of reverence for Khrushchev, in 1% what it was for Stalin. You had statues of Stalin being taken down. What I think the major step forward under Khrushchev is that you had the government for the first time acknowledging that it did the wrong thing in the past, which was not the case before. Like whatever the government did was correct, even if it contradicted what it did yesterday. We've always been at war with East Asia or Eurasia, right? And they start to rehabilitate people, which means that like if I had been in my lifetime denounced as any of the people and killed, they just went through and publicly said, okay, this was wrong. This person is still a good guy, so on and so forth. And yes, it's baby steps, and it was still obviously a very brutal totalitarian regime, but there were moments where they certainly went in a more honest and better direction.
I'm thinking back to my college experience because I entered college in 1990. Cold War was winding down, but I would nevertheless, when I would go to the dining room, I would see people selling a communist newspaper. And they were people who wanted to commemorate the Bolshevik Revolution. They were genuinely deploring the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, usually people you would run into would say, oh, that wasn't real communism. You get that all the time. That wasn't real communism. That was an authoritarian variant, but that's not what we favor. But I was coming face to face with people who said, no, at the very least, the Bolshevik Revolution and everything Lenin did, they had absolutely no objection to that at all. And then there are people like Angela Davis is a professor at a California university to this day, who during the 70s was feted and welcomed in all these East European regimes. She was awarded the Lenin
as
Peace
vice
Prize,
president on the CP ticket.
the ticket in the U.S., yes. And she is still, and when she was asked, listen, could you maybe use some of your influence to help some of these dissidents get out of prison for being political prisoners? And her answer was, they deserve what they get. Let them remain in prison. Nobody cares. Her lectures sell out. Everybody loves her. She's a big celebrity. Nobody cares. I mean, what kind of ridiculous double standard is this?
I don't think it's ridiculous at all. I'm not surprised.
Well, by the standards of a person who believes in justice, it defies comprehension.
But that's a rare commodity.
Yeah. I saw her. I was at the Harvard graduation the following year to see some of my friends graduate. And I saw her walking around the campus. And I said, is that Angela Davis? Yes, it was. So this woman who just cavalierly, she could have potentially maybe gotten a few people released from prison and said, nah, I don't want to do that. And then she was genuinely sorry when the Soviet Union dissolved.
But Tom, didn't she actually kill people? I thought she did engage in some kind of low-key terrorism. Let me look her up.
She was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, but I don't remember what she was accused of doing offhand. I should know that. I wrote something about her years ago, but the details are fuzzy.
Yeah, no. Guns belonging to Davis were used in an armed takeover of a courtroom in which 4 people were killed. She was prosecuted, but then held in jail for a year before being acquitted in 1972, yeah.
Okay.
And she's also, by the way, she's also very heavily in favor of abolishing prisons in America.
I have heard that.
Yeah.
I have heard that. So,
yeah.
I don't know. Takes all kinds, I guess. Well,
yes.
The thing is, I have to end the episode because I have a certain number of minutes I do each episode, but I assume the nice thing is people know that there is a happy ending to all this eventually. So, I mean, like today, we've had to talk about some extremely gruesome episodes in history, but when the ultimate resolution comes, it's extremely heartwarming. In fact, I've shown my daughters, even when they were younger, like 10 years old, I've shown them footage of the Berlin Wall coming down, people going through the gate, people being reunited with family members, things like that. And they were just absolutely drawn to it. Like, this is a real thing that happened. This isn't a movie. This is a real thing that happened. I mean, it brings a tear to my eye to show this footage to them.
Well, you know, until I wrote this book, I don't think even I appreciated why all those things you just mentioned were such a big deal. And one of my favorite moments, the Berlin Wall was around for, 25 years or so, is they didn't even bother to call Russia, let alone Gorbachev. So the Berlin Wall falls. Literally, people are singing and dancing and popping champagne on top of the Berlin Wall, right? And you can only imagine Gorbachev wakes up and turns on the TV. And you can imagine what went through his head, where he's just trying to change the channel, being like, this can't be real.
You know, I remember some old TV footage from around the time that the wall was being, because initially, as you know, it was barbed wire. And that wasn't enough because people would just try to run through the barbed wire. So it became a wall, but there were like apartment buildings right alongside there. So the problem was that people on one side could go into the apartment building and then jump out a window onto the other side. And there were people who would help them down, and they would help people escape that way. So then they bricked up all those windows so you couldn't do that.
And then you couldn't see.
Yeah. Just the anti-fascist barrier, that took the cake.
Well, it was just really, it worked. Not one fascist even so much as tried to get into East Berlin.
You have to hand it to them. It's true.
Yeah.
All right. The book is The White Pill, A Tale of Good and Evil by Michael Malice. And you can pick it up through the link at tomwoods.com/2292. Or you can just go to a fine book vendor online, just type it in. But if you want old Woods to maybe get a little piece of the action here, then click the link at tomwoods.com/2292. Michael, we'll get you back because, of course, we cannot leave the story hanging like this. We'll carry it through all the way to the glorious finish. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.